I am going to bring about the end of civilization. You cannot stop me. Zombies, fungi, viruses, flooding, worldwide vape ban, doesn't matter. This society thing we got here should be pretty easy to topple, but what comes after? Well, that's where it gets interesting. Hey, remember when I said,
I'm working on an in-depth critique of The Walking Dead?
Well, this is that, or at least what that became. It's not massive, obviously, but I realized that I didn't feel like ranting about The Walking Dead's poor writing choices for hours on end, not when I've since proven to myself that I can be more constructive. Hey, remember also when I also said,
I'd rather set my story in a world that has only the relevant components and factions and nothing else. It's no surprise that most of my writing leans post-apocalyptic.
Well, that's truer now than ever. For as long as I can remember, I've been more or less infatuated with the doom of man as a device for storytelling. After all, the generations upon generations that preceded our recorded history lived in a world that we would, at a glance, identify as apocalyptic, which becomes even more profound when you realize that human evolution, that is, the evolution of the human brain and all of its glorious isms, took place almost entirely in a primal hellscape. I mean, if you went back 30,000 years, plucked a 2-year-old out of a cave and sat him in a first-grade classroom, he would develop just like any other kid. That's how slow evolution is. And then suddenly we figured a few things out, and our generational knowledge began to compound at an alarming rate, and now we have YouTube, where I get to blast words directly into your ear holes. Which brings me to the topic of today's video, The Walking Dead. Does anyone know what it's actually about, thematically? Something humanity, right? Well, I'm gonna tear it up live, because as much as I enjoyed parts of this show's run, it is the exemplar of thematic malpractice. You know the drill. I take the central idea of a story, I ask what are all of the relevant perspectives one could have on this idea, and then I turn each perspective into a single character. Just a couple of clarifications on this. Yes, there is wiggle room, so long as you're wiggling the right ways. Sometimes, for instance, you need a functional character, which basically means you've created a character who embodies a meaningful perspective on the theme, but in backwards domino affecting their origin story, you've realized that they couldn't have gotten to that point alone. Maybe their development necessitates an abusive parent or a lost love or something. So you have to create a character to fill that role, even if that character doesn't necessarily tie into the main thematic debate. The wisdom in this is being able to distinguish between thematic characters and functional characters. You should always try to make your thematic characters functional. Like if you need a troubled parent figure, reach into your existing pool of thematic orientations and see if one of those could multitask. That's efficiency. But if not, then you can create a new functional character. The key is in not forgetting the purpose of that character and limiting that character's involvement to their specific purpose. Do we need to know the abusive parent figure's favorite food, or their music taste, or their career even? Avoid depth for the sake of depth. Without purpose, depth is a waste of time. Another thing, because I know I'll look hypocritical if I don't address this, overlap or even duplication of character traits is not always a sign of inefficiency. It usually is, but again, purpose is key. If introducing a character as a mirror image of another character deliberately pushes the story forward, then it's an acceptable use of repetition.
Back to it.
Now, if my premise were, say, a zombie apocalypse, I might instinctively start listing off permutations of the ordinary everyday person. A sheriff, a pizza guy, a battered wife, a kid, etc. And I might tell myself this is going to be a show where I explore how those average everyday people would behave in a zombie apocalypse scenario. And I might give them interesting personalities and backstories and casting, and I might tell myself that I've constructed a succinct and dynamic ensemble. After all, they have deep conversations about hope sometimes, they get into arguments. Sure, this'll last 177 episodes, no problem. But I would be wrong. I think The Walking Dead's first few seasons had some really strong material, but in hindsight, the problems were baked in from the very beginning. Similarly to Lost, which I could do a whole nother video about, this show did not successfully orient its characters around its central ideas, and that failure would eventually prove to be its downfall from a writing standpoint. It just wasn't evident at first. For instance, take the Rick versus Shane plotline from Season 2, which many consider to be among the show's best. Rick believes that civility and diplomacy are the path towards a better future, and Shane believes that those things are weaknesses and that brutality is the only way to survive. It leads to a really compelling conflict that doesn't overstay its welcome. But people don't like Season 2, because in addition to that big, thematically relevant showdown, it has several other plots that kinda just happen, and that goes for the whole show. And I'm not saying subplots like Glenn and Maggie aren't compelling in their own right, just that they aren't woven into the bigger thematic picture as well as they could be. Moreover, the big ethical through line represented by Shane and Rick's conflict is diluted by other characters who have the same opinions and waste screen time fighting about them. Exhibit A, Dale. Dale is a quirky older man with a father-daughter relationship to Andrea, but that's just his personality. What does he bring to the table, thematically speaking? He's hopeful, he believes there's still a chance, but you know, those are Rick's core traits. Every Dale scene that matters, he's just putting forth ideas that are already embodied by Rick. You could argue that Dale is the angel on Rick's shoulder, but Rick is already such an angel himself. Dale could have worked as a character if Rick were in a darker place, but his tenure has no overlap with his function. How about Andrea, for that matter? She's a relatively hopeful person and then loses a loved one and subsequently loses that hope. This sounds like a direction Rick's character should be taking, and eventually it is. If Rick's arc is that of a man losing his hope in community, but then ultimately coming back to the light, this beat is inevitable for him. Why are we exploring it now with another character and a subplot that will ultimately prove to be redundant? But I know most people don't like Dale and Andrea, so let me actually ruffle a few feathers. What is the purpose of Glenn? I'm not asking why you like watching Glenn, because I like watching Glenn. He's a rather entertaining and lovable character, I get that. But in the thematic framework of the story, what is his purpose? What does he add to the conversation? Okay, I know I might have lost some of you with my hyper-utilitarian approach to this stuff, and for what it's worth, my actual writing gets much more flowery and extraneous when I finally put pen to page, but what I'm trying to get across, what I've always preached on this channel, is that a story should have a deliberate framework of themes, and it should never leave that framework. Not to flesh out a side character, not to have a little romance arc, never. Everything serves the theme. This feels like a good time to discuss the concept of filler, because I think there are misconceptions about what that means and when it's a problem. So Mad Max Fury Road, Top 5, has a collection of intimate character scenes that are massively padded out by stylish action set pieces. And those set pieces don't need to be long or elaborate to tell the story on a structural level, but they are, and it works. So why is this kind of filler okay, but the kind I deride The Walking Dead for is not? Well, it has to do with the degree to which that filler tries to engage with the drama. I think filler is perfectly fine when it's unapologetic. So if I were in The Walking Dead's writer's room and we were at 40 pages and we needed to hit 45 for TV, kind of a dated problem, and the two options to fill that space were A, a conversation between two side characters where they talk about their experiences and emotions, and B, a cool action sequence with zero character development, I would probably go with B. Obviously, it depends on the context, but assuming the episode had already hit its desired character beats, I wouldn't want to dilute that, Entertainment value is a different discussion altogether, but in principle, I think once you get your character scenes nailed down, you can fill in the gaps as minimally or as extravagantly as you want. Just let a scene be honest with itself about how important it is. Only you can know what that means in the context of your story, but I know that in The Walking Dead's case, the writing consists of 50% on-theme content and 50%, well, I don't really have a word for it. A prevailing notion in the writing community, but ensemble television in particular, is that all you need to tell a compelling story is a group of characters with personalities that the audience can get invested in. Usually a big part of this is the cast. If you've ever felt that an actor was indispensable to the quality of your favorite show, you can probably understand where I'm coming from. And I'm not just saying, oh, I couldn't imagine anyone except Bryan Cranston playing Walter White. I'm referring to shows where the casting is literally the main appeal of the thing itself, like Seinfeld or any rom-com with two big-name actors. Not to discredit acting, obviously, but I think it's easy to get swept up in a character-actor synthesis and overvalue it. That's a big part of what I see fandoms doing. Even the most production-illiterate fans will still go bananas for the cast, despite possibly not knowing what a screenplay is. So I'm going to ask you to get Steven Yeun's beautiful face out of your head for a second and look at Glenn on the page. What are the facts here? He's a helpful kid, he has a positive disposition, he gets a little romance arc, he's around for a while, still doing the romance thing, and then he dies in an act of indiscriminate violence. I don't know. I think Glenn is all personality and no purpose, and I think that's a great way to describe most of the characters in this show. Just empty vessels meant to hold the audience's attention without ever really pushing the broader contentions of the story forward. And there's nothing wrong with just getting the audience attached to your characters so that they're happy when good things happen to them and sad when bad things happen to them. But my point is that you can have both. You can create a really strong thematic foundation and then build relatable, engaging characters on top of it. So I'm going to rewrite The Walking Dead using my process. Disclaimer, I have never read the comics, nothing is sacred to me, I'm going to be mangling characters and events beyond recognition to achieve my ends, and this is an outline of the main plot beats. I'm not really addressing the connective tissue, so if it seems like bare bones stuff, you're right. Swag? Okay, let's go. So my first order of business in this rewrite is to identify a core moral through line. The thing is, this show is flabby and tries to be about everything, so selecting one through line means chopping and screwing all the others to better serve it. If we're extending this out from Rick's arc, meaning we center this series around civility versus brutality, some very obvious perspectives emerge. You could cling to civility, you could drop your morals and accept that civility is dead, you could feel freed by the collapse of civility, you could deny that civility ever left, you could take advantage of that last group while actually believing the opposite, and that's really it. So, with a post-apocalyptic world and a cast of characters that all see that world in different ways, where can we find this story? Well, there's a reason people regard the barn scene as such a good moment. It's the climax of a conflict between three major perspectives. Herschel thinks the walkers are still people. Because of that, he's treating them as such and creating a major safety risk. Rick respects Herschel's beliefs because Herschel is their host. That's in line with the core of his character. But Shane sees a threat to his people and takes action at the expense of civility. He's a survivor at any cost. Three major ideological players are coming into conflict. That's what makes it a memorable arc. The dialogue isn't manufactured trash because it doesn't have to be. The writers knew exactly how these characters would interact. There's actual narrative meat. So in my new version, that whole arc stays. It's just trimmed down because I cut out the other stuff from season 2. And then we get to the Rick and Shane conflict. Even though it's a big subplot in the show, I think Shane's love for Lori has the potential to undermine the narrative. The core of Shane's character should be his by any means mentality, which Rick rejects. Their conflict should come when Shane does something horrible for the survival of the group and Rick can't accept it. His morals are still intact, so he kills Shane and tells himself it was right, which becomes ironic when he himself succumbs to the same darkness later in the story. We know that Rick's response to finding out Lori slept with Shane will just be, "It's okay, you didn't know," because he's a level-headed person. So the tension of that secret is non-existent. Lori's role in this new revamped story is to serve as Rick's lifeline to his inner humanity. Shane didn't have a Lori, but Rick does. Rick's stability and respect are derived from his happy marriage. So Rick kills Shane, still believing himself to be good and moral, but then Lori dies. Bitch. Her death isn't random, more on that later, but it's what sends Rick spiraling. Rick becomes brutal and violent without his lifeline. He still has Carl, who becomes his sole reason for existing. When it comes to parenting Carl, he becomes like Shane. He embraces his brutal survivalist instincts, and those instincts are represented by Michonne. Michonne in my rewrite is kind of a copy of Shane, who's framed in the opposite way. With Michonne, Rick sinks deeper and deeper into violence. He only leaves that state when Carl dies. Yes, in my rewrite, Carl still dies, only it's not as a result of some random bullshit, it's directly Rick's fault. Rick slowly realizes the error of his ways, building himself back up, but in doing so, he's making an enemy in Michonne. So the real big bad of my rewrite is Michonne. She's the demon Rick has to slay to redeem himself. And he does, and after going through and making it back out, Rick becomes the savior of civilization. The end. Again, this is the core plot of my rewrite. There might be some other characters, other subplots, but they all have to serve this. If they don't get to exist. I love the governor. Maybe in this rewrite, he could be the person who plants the idea that everything is okay. Maybe he's directly responsible for how Herschel and his family see the world. Maybe the governor is a manipulator who preys on people's desire for safety, and we create an arc for Herschel where he begins to see through the governor's lies. Season 1, we're introduced to the world and the characters. This takes a couple episodes. Rick and Shane are established to have clearly different morals. They have smaller conflicts at first, stuff you wouldn't pay as much attention to, but then, midway through season 1, we get to the farm. That's right, the farm. And the farm, as a location, is actually combined with Woodbury. Here at Woodbury, the governor rules by convincing people everything will be okay, that the apocalypse doesn't exist here. It's a paradise. Rick respects the way things are, Shane doesn't. Some version of the Shane versus Herschel plotline happens, the piece of Woodbury is destroyed because of Shane's actions. Shane then stages a coup at Woodbury. He faces off against the governor and somehow wins. Rick can't allow Shane to rule, so he deposes Shane. Now Rick is the leader of Woodbury. He has the moral high ground, and his family is still intact. That's season 1. So here's season 2. Things are good at Woodbury for a while, but Rick's benevolent, honest approach to leadership has some dire consequences. Through some sequence of events, Woodbury is compromised. Lori, Rick's lifeline, is killed. The whole town falls because of Rick. He hates himself for being so naive and optimistic. Lori could become a thematic character retroactively once Rick moves towards the middle of the spectrum, kind of what I was talking about with Dale. Now, with nothing but Carl, Rick hits the road. He's emotionally lost, but he finds a new belonging with Michonne. She's fully attuned to the apocalypse. She kills without mercy. Rick grows to love her, and he finds some sort of happiness. But season 3, Rick has a limit. When Michonne's morals end in Carl's death, don't ask me how, Rick realizes that she's wrong. Now it's Rick versus Michonne. Rick leads a new community while Michonne leads a group of Ravagers. Maybe she even goes so far off the deep end that her group becomes the Whisperers. They're pretty cool. And the climax of the show is a battle for the fate of humanity. Do we stand against the chaos of the apocalypse, or do we become one with it? That was a 3-season show I just pulled out of my ass. There was no Negan, no kingdom, no ocean, people, like 90% of the show removed. I'm not saying it doesn't pain me to cut out so much memorable stuff. I'm not saying my rewrite wouldn't run into its own problems, but for me, that's what it would take to create a thematically focused version of The Walking Dead. Like I was saying earlier, apocalypses reduce people down to their core priorities, which makes it very hard to write an apocalyptic story with a big sprawling cast. If the world has gone to shit, how complicated could things really be to necessitate such a huge ensemble? And then to move all of those characters across the board at once without letting any fade into irrelevance or repetition, it borders on impossible. But man oh man is there a better way to do it. If the logic of The Walking Dead were applied to this show, an episode would start with the Joel and Ellie plot, and then we'd get hit with a Tommy scene even though he's miles away. And then we'd get hit with a Sam and Henry scene in Kansas City, and then we'd check back in on Marlene, and then back to Joel, and then back to Tommy, because the show would feel obligated to keep all these characters in our minds, even if they weren't doing anything relevant. Like, tell me how accurate this sounds. The Walking Dead writers would come up with some season-long subplot where Tommy is building a barn, and his wife Maria would come over and she'd be like, "Tommy, are you alright? You look stressed." And he'd be like, "Yeah, honey, I'm just thinking about life, and this barn is really important to me because me and Joel, we talked about building a barn." And she'd be like, "I know you miss him." And he would be like, "Yeah, I do." And that conversation would continue like that for another 5 minutes with zero development, and then some infected would randomly attack the town and Tommy would have to fend them off. But my point is that The Last of Us doesn't do this. It doesn't feel the need to. And at first I thought this was just a POV thing, but The Last of Us breaks POV all the time. The camera isn't even remotely tied down to Joel and Ellie. Within its own rules, this show could have given us scenes with Tommy or Marlene or any of the other supporting characters. So why doesn't it? Well, I think it's because the writers are smart enough to know when supporting characters are needed and when they're not. Like, especially in the later seasons, The Walking Dead felt deeply committed to the idea of having a big, intricate world where every character was three-dimensional. The show would introduce a character as minor and then start boosting their screen time and give them a backstory and some more dialogue scenes, and I have a feeling the writers thought this was really inventive while they were doing it. Like having a main character just come out of the woodwork, go from a glorified extra to a name on the title sequence. There's a certain novelty to that. But in the long run, I think it really sucks. I always return to my rule number 3, which is that it's not about the audience. Like, if you decide to give a minor character a big dialogue scene, just take a step back and ask why you want that to happen. If it's because they have a relevant perspective that needs to be voiced at this point in the story, awesome, that's natural and purposeful. But if it's just because you want to flesh them out so that the audience cares more, you're falling into the same trap that killed The Walking Dead. Tommy gets like 6 scenes in the whole first season of The Last of Us, and every one of them matters. I think there's a certain maturity to just letting characters disappear for a while until they become relevant again. And you might think, well, what if the audience is really invested in this supporting character of mine? I can't just ignore them for 11 chapters until they do something meaningful again. Yes, you can actually. You can and you should. And if that's not an option, if you have a character who's right there in the mix of everything and you still have no idea what to do with that character, it might be time for some introspection. People will notice if you start artificially inflating a character who has no real role in the emotional or philosophical framework of your story. But she's one of the main group and she's the least developed. I have to find something for her to do. No, you genuinely don't. Matter of fact, if finding something for a character to do is even a problem you're facing, you messed up a long time ago. Maybe that character should have been combined with another character, or stored at another location, or relegated to an extra with 2 lines. Maybe that character shouldn't even exist. These are the things that you gotta ask yourself if you want your writing to be focused and purposeful. And it's clear that The Last of Us understands this because it'll bring in new characters to offer new perspectives on its central theme, and then it will discard them when they're no longer needed. Just like, hey, here's what I can offer on the topic of the relationship between ethics and compassion. Okay, that's it, goodbye. My favorite film of all time ever, Children of Men, does the exact same thing with its themes, once again amidst the apocalypse, and I try to replicate it in my own writing. I kill off characters frequently, not for shock value, not for anything on the receiving end, but for the story itself. And I've loosened up on my view of symbolism in that regard. A year ago, I would have made a face at Kathleen's death, since objectively it's just a random enemy jumping out and biting her. But since her role thematically centers around her willingness to let Sam, a child, die, and more broadly, her big picture absolutism, minimizing any empathy towards other people's struggles, having a child clicker take her out is very appropriate. I mean, since her faction had already lost due to ignoring the infected threat under the city, which was her decision, killing her was kind of a formality. I do think there's room for thematically appropriate chaos like that, as well as Sam getting bit. Like, the only reason Sam gets bit is to tie Henry and Kathleen's conflict up in a nice little bow. After Henry completely debased himself to save his brother, the kid ended up just falling victim to the horrors of the world, and Henry kills himself over it. This is exactly what Marlene tells Joel at the hospital, that he's destroying humanity's one chance for a girl that could just die in a week anyway. And herein lies what I see as the ideal use of supporting characters. They can have simple and extreme perspectives, and the protagonist can be more in the middle, caught between those perspectives, internally conflicted. And so supporting characters can represent potential futures for the protagonist. And the protagonist can see those fringe supporting characters meet their ultimate fates and can either learn lessons or ignore them. In this case, Joel meets a parallel father figure who is similarly prioritizing the protection of a child. These characters are better positioned to serve the story when they can enter as needed and exit when that need no longer exists. If you just buckle them in for the whole journey, they'll suck the air out of the room by spouting meaningless, interchangeable, characterless dialogue until it's finally their time to shine. I can imagine a scenario in the Walking Dead writer's room where they need to have someone say, "We gotta go, the walkers will be here any minute." And one writer's like, "Okay, so I think we should have Glenn say that." And someone else is like, "Wait, can we have Carol say it? Because she hasn't said anything for the whole scene." And someone else is like, "Yeah, but in the last scene she said, 'We just need to hope,' and that was a big moment or something, so maybe we should give the line to Aaron." And that's a conversation that needs to be had for basically every line. Which is why I consider bad dialogue to be a potential symptom of larger problems. Like, don't get me wrong, writing emotive musical dialogue that sounds natural coming out of a person's mouth is an art you'll never stop getting better at. But if you look at your writing and your dialogue feels truly stilted and wrong, it might not be a skill issue. Maybe you have two characters occupying the same role thematically, so there's nothing meaningful for them to argue about, even if they do have radically different personalities and aesthetics. I mean, think about it. The Last of Us is so secure in its characters that it has no problem cutting entire action set pieces from the game. It doesn't need a clicker attack every 20 minutes to hold your attention. Its characters, their dialogue, and their choices do all of the heavy lifting, which makes it a phenomenally written show. In contrast, The Walking Dead has so much flab that its final thematic message is literally just, "We're the ones who live," because anything more specific than that would exclude major swaths of the story. This show's thematic umbrella has to be so absurdly big to keep everything dry that I find it impossible to view as a cohesive work of fiction. And I get it, I've botched a thematic cocktail and tried to pass it off as jungle juice, but I've learned that with proper planning, all of that can be avoided. You can have focused writing that still checks off all of your other boxes. It just takes patience, discipline, and above all, an acute understanding of why every element of your story exists. I don't have much else to talk about. Like I said, this was originally going to be a full critique of The Walking Dead, but I like my new style a lot more, leaning more educational, critique as a means to an end, and I hope that you can all appreciate what I'm trying to do here as well. But I also have some real life advice, maybe. I don't know, you decide, I could be full shit. When I was a boy, growing up in Ohio, the apocalypse had a different meaning for me than the one I described earlier. At the time, I felt deeply socially isolated, and because of that, I adopted a jaded attitude towards all of the childhood fun that was happening around me. I had no idea how my peers could take so much enjoyment and meaning from the trivial nonsense of day-to-day existence. Hearing their mindless laughter echo in my skull for 7 hours a day made me feel like progressively more of an outcast, because I was unable to truly participate due to my anxiety. I have very few memories of genuinely, authentically playing with other kids, but what I do remember were the daydreams. I would sit there and imagine what would happen if a tsunami hit, or another country suddenly started bombing us, or Joseph Kony kidnapped us all at recess. I wished that a crisis would occur, because then everyone would be in survival mode just like me, and I wouldn't feel alone anymore. Of course, as an adult, I can recognize this as the unsound thought process it was. But even now, I sometimes catch myself getting overwhelmed by the chaos of work and relationships and YouTube, and retreating into a fantasy where none of that matters, and basic needs are the only needs. Which is all to say, I understand the urge to run from complexity. But when I say characters aren't people, that's a double-edged sword. It's also true that people aren't characters. When you wield the power of narrative like we do, it's tempting to try and use it as a tool to beat reality into submission. But reality will always be more complicated and scarier and more confusing than any narrative can fully encompass. And as creatives, it's important to ask ourselves whether we're doing this to understand life or to escape it, you know? And I have a vested interest in the world being a stable and safe place, because I'm an artist. I wouldn't be able to access these higher faculties if my life were on the line 24/7. I only exist in peacetime. In many ways, my inclination to create is a sign that I'm fundamentally okay, and I always try to remember that. But anyways, subscribe to my channel if you like pina coladas, and consider leaving a thumbs up if you wouldn't mind getting caught in the rain either. Engagement, something, you know what's up. I'm also on Patreon. The content stream has admittedly been a little slower these last few weeks, but I really appreciate everyone sticking with me. My sincere thanks to Aaron Rockensock, Alex Moore, Elise Ottmain, Arcane Wit, Bradley Crone, DeWald Oliver, Elijah K. Ashburn, Eric J. Moffat, Evan Wiles, Gubbins, Hamoon Bertram, Jack Weilman, Jake Eckenrode, Janelle Jones, Jarrett Tyree, Joanna Van Brunt, Joseph Daniel Rodriguez, Jude Abu Hamda, Lee Sanchez, Lyon, Lucas, Matthew Torres, Micah Zagrabelny, Makeel N. Muqtada, Nachos, Nathaniel, Poopshoe Rogers, Prolificity, Raphael D'Amico, Regin Frosch, Ryoshi, Shulamit Simon, Source Cotton, Teddy Squid, Theodore Lechkin, Tom Astian, Trevor Carson, and Verislav. I would lick the Chernobyl elephant's foot for each and every one of you. I added 2 more chapters to my video essay class about getting engagement through comments and making money respectively, so if that sounds like you, pull up. It's not just a YouTube self-help course, it's really about marketing and holding the audience's attention. And since you're still watching this video, all I'm gonna say. Plus, there's some other fun stuff available on there, a special look at my upcoming documentary, my short films, and the glowing satisfaction associated with helping me financially so that I can finally move out of your walls. Peace and love, you're gonna do great, I believe in you, goodbye.